The dust had not yet settled on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, when Alfred Bailey did the one thing every soul in the territory swore he would never do. He dropped to one knee. The sun was bleeding orange and red across the western sky, painting the rooftops of the saloon and the general store in colors that looked borrowed from a painting nobody deserved to own. His hat was in his left hand, pressed against his chest like he was stopping a wound from opening. His right hand trembled, and Alfred Bailey's hands never trembled, not when he faced down a man with a drawn pistol on the road to Wichita, not when a stampede of longhorns had swept through camp and taken 3 men with it, not when the sheriff of this very town had pointed a rifle between his eyes and told him to ride out and never come back. But they trembled now, because Pauline Lawson was standing 3 feet away from him, with tears cutting clean lines through the trail dust on her face, and she was staring at him like he was either the most terrifying thing she had ever seen or the only true thing left in a world made entirely of lies. "Alfred, don't," she whispered, and her voice broke on his name like it always had, like his name was a splinter she couldn't stop touching. "I told you I'd never kneel for anyone," he said. His voice was rough. It was always rough, like gravel rolled through creek water, but right now it carried something that had never been in it before, something that sounded dangerously close to surrender. "I meant it when I said it." The whole town seemed to be holding its breath. 2 men had frozen on the saloon porch. Old Bessie Crane had stopped sweeping her store front. Even the horses tied at the rail stood still. "Then stand up," Pauline said, but she did not step back. She did not look away. "I can't," Alfred said simply, "not until you hear me." And that was where everything that had been building for 6 weeks, 4 days, and a collection of heartbreaks that felt like bullets, finally broke the surface. To understand how a man like Alfred Bailey ended up on one knee before sundown on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1877, you have to go back to the morning Pauline Lawson stepped off the stage. The Kansas and Colorado stage line ran through Caldwell twice a week, bringing mail, supplies, and occasionally people who had no good reason to be arriving at the edge of the frontier. Caldwell sat right on the border with Indian Territory, which meant it was the last real town before the wilderness swallowed everything whole. It had a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, 3 saloons, a general store run by a man named Hoskins, a livery stable, a doctor who was also the dentist and the barber, and a population of 312 souls who all knew each other's business before it had even happened. Alfred Bailey did not live in Caldwell exactly. He worked a cattle operation 6 miles south, a spread of 1,200 acres he had built with nothing but his back and a temperament so hard it bent steel. He had come to town that morning in late September because Hoskins owed him a credit on a spool of fence wire, and he intended to collect it. He had not intended to be standing at the corner of Main and First Street when the stage rattled in, but he was. The door opened and 3 passengers stepped down, a banker type with soft hands and a new suit, a traveling merchant with 2 trunks and the anxious look of a man who had heard too many stories, and then Pauline Lawson. She stepped down with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been told her whole life to be careful, to take up less space, to move quietly. But there was something about the way she lifted her chin when she cleared the stage door, something about the way her dark eyes swept the street and took in everything at once, that told Alfred she was not a woman who was actually comfortable being small. She had simply learned to perform it. She was 23 years old. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue wool that had seen better days, and she carried a single carpet bag and a leather satchel. Her dark hair was pinned back practically under a small hat, and her face was the kind of face that asked no favors and offered none in return. Alfred watched her for exactly 4 seconds before he looked away. He was not in the habit of staring at women who arrived on stages. It never led anywhere good. What he could not have predicted was that she would walk directly toward him, not at him precisely. She was heading toward the general store and he was standing in her path, and she was not the type to redirect herself around a man who was in the way. She simply kept walking, and when she was close enough that stopping was unavoidable, she stopped. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was steady and direct. East Coast vowels that had been roughed up slightly by what sounded like several hard years somewhere in between. "Is this Hoskins' General Store?" "It is," Alfred said. "Thank you," she said, and she moved past him without another glance. He stood there for a moment. Then he collected himself, pushed through the door after her because he had business inside, and tried to be annoyed about it. Hoskins was behind the counter, and he lit up when Pauline walked in, which told Alfred that the storekeeper had been expecting her. "Miss Lawson," Hoskins said warmly, "you made it. I was beginning to worry about the road from Wichita." "The road from Wichita is survivable," Pauline said, setting her carpet bag down. "I need to ask you about the schoolteacher position. Your letter said the town had approved it." Alfred stopped pretending to examine the hardware shelf. "We have," Hoskins said, and then he dropped his voice like he was delivering unfortunate news, though he kept smiling. "Though I should tell you there's been some disagreement about the terms. Nothing that can't be worked out, I'm sure." "What kind of disagreement?" Pauline asked. Alfred reached for the fence wire spool and then put it back. He was not eavesdropping. He was simply standing in a small store. "Some of the ranchers feel the schoolteacher should live with a family for propriety's sake, rather than in the teacherage alone," Hoskins said. "Particularly since the church council that runs the school has 2 or 3 members who are," he searched for the word, "traditional." "I was promised the teacherage," Pauline said. Her voice had gone flat and precise, the way a blade goes still before it cuts. "That was part of the agreement in the correspondence." "Yes, ma'am, it was," Hoskins agreed. "And I for one think you should have it. But there's one gentleman in particular who's been making noise about it, and since his children will be among your students and he contributes considerably to the church fund." "Who is he?" Pauline asked. Hoskins hesitated. Then, with the careful look of a man diffusing something, he said, "His name is Garrett Cole." Alfred put the fence wire spool down on the counter. Both Hoskins and Pauline looked at him. "I'll take the wire," Alfred said to Hoskins. Then he looked at Pauline. "Garrett Cole is a problem. He's been running this town's church council like a private fiefdom for 3 years. If you let him set the terms on the teacherage, he'll run your life." Pauline looked at him with the kind of steady regard that told him she was assessing whether he was useful or just noisy. "And who are you?" she asked. "Alfred Bailey," he said. "I run cattle south of town. I'm also on the school board, which Cole does not control and which approved your contract, which means if he tries to override it, he'll have to go through me." There was a pause. "Thank you, Mr. Bailey," Pauline said, not warmly, not coldly, simply with the precision of someone who filed information away carefully. "I'll remember that." She turned back to Hoskins and began discussing her supply order. Alfred paid for his wire, loaded it in his wagon, and drove back to his spread, telling himself firmly that the new schoolteacher was not his concern. He was back in Caldwell the next morning. He told himself it was about a different matter with Hoskins, and that was technically true. He had a question about a delivery of salt blocks. But he arrived at 9 in the morning, which was exactly when the school day would be beginning across the street, and he stood outside the store just long enough to watch Pauline Lawson shepherd 8 children through the church door with the calm authority of someone who had been doing exactly this for years. She caught him watching. She gave him a single measured nod and then closed the door. Alfred went in to see Hoskins about the salt blocks. That week, he found 3 reasons to come to town. The following week, he found 4. By the 3rd week of October, he had stopped pretending to himself that any of it was about supplies or fencing or business of any kind. He had started coming to Caldwell in the mornings because at some point between sunrise and the first school bell, he could usually find a reason to be in proximity to Pauline Lawson, and proximity to Pauline Lawson had become, without his permission, the most interesting part of his day. She was not an easy woman to know. She did not volunteer information about herself. She answered direct questions with precision, but without warmth toward anyone she had not yet decided to trust. She was furiously competent at her work. 3 of the children she taught had arrived barely able to read their names, and within 2 weeks she had them sounding through full sentences with the patient relentlessness of someone who refused to accept that anything was impossible. What Alfred noticed and filed away and turned over in his mind during the long, dark hours of the cattle nights was that Pauline Lawson was fighting something. Not the children, not the work, not even Garrett Cole's political maneuvering about the teacherage, though that was a genuine and ongoing problem. She was fighting something inside herself, something that had to do with trust, with the specific way she watched people's hands when they spoke to her, with the small flinch she concealed perfectly whenever a voice rose unexpectedly nearby. He recognized that kind of fighting. He had done it himself for years after his father had died and left him a failing ranch, 3 debts, and a reputation he had not earned. The kind of fighting where you build yourself so hard on the outside that nothing can get through, and you call that safety, and you survive on it, even as it slowly starves you. He had no business caring about any of this. He cared about it anyway. The first real conversation they had happened on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, when the weather broke unseasonably warm and Pauline had let the children out early. Alfred was coming out of the livery stable with his horse when he found her sitting on the bench outside the general store, not doing anything except looking at the horizon with an expression he could not entirely read. He could have tipped his hat and kept walking. The sensible version of Alfred Bailey would have done exactly that. He tied his horse to the rail and sat down on the other end of the bench. She glanced at him. "You don't seem like the kind of man who sits on benches," she said. "I'm not," he admitted. "But you look like you're thinking hard about something that might be worth talking about." "Or it might not be," she said. "True," he agreed. They sat in silence for a moment. The warm October wind moved through the street, picking up dust and setting it down again somewhere else. "Garrett Cole came to the school today," Pauline said finally. Her voice was level, but her hands on her lap were pressed together in a way that was not casual. Alfred was very still. "What did he say?" "He told me that the terms of my contract regarding the teacherage would be under review at the next church council meeting," Pauline said. "He was polite about it." "He was very, very polite about it, which I have learned is usually when a threat is being delivered." "He's not wrong that he can call a review," Alfred said carefully. "But the school board contract supersedes the church council on housing, according to the town charter. I drew that line specifically so the council couldn't control teachers the way they controlled the last one." Pauline turned to look at him then, really look at him, and he held her gaze and let her examine whatever she was looking for. "Why?" she asked. "Why what? Why did you draw that line? Why do you care what happens to the school teacher?" Alfred considered the question honestly, the way he tried to consider most things. "The last school teacher was a man named Grover Hensley," he said. "He was good at his work and honest about it. Cole got him placed with the Cole family for his housing, and within 6 months Hensley was teaching what Cole wanted taught and nothing else. 2 of the children on my spread never learned to read properly because of it." He paused. "I drew the line because children deserve better than that, same as teachers." Pauline was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You have children on your spread." 3 families work the ranch with me," Alfred said. "Married men with kids. I pay wages and they work cattle. Their children should have a real education." Something shifted in her expression, fractionally. Not warmth exactly, but the door where warmth might eventually enter had opened a sliver. "I'm from Boston originally," she said, which was the first thing she had volunteered about herself in 3 weeks. "I came out here because the school systems back east are controlled by different kinds of men doing different kinds of politics, and I thought out here at least the problems would be straightforward." She looked back at the horizon. "They're not more straightforward, they're just louder about it." "That's a fair assessment of Kansas," Alfred said. And she laughed. It was quiet and brief and contained, but it was absolutely real, and Alfred Bailey felt it hit him somewhere in the chest like a piece of thrown gravel, small and sharp and unexpectedly significant. He did not examine that feeling for the rest of the afternoon. He had cattle to see to. He examined it for most of the night. The church council meeting happened on a Thursday evening in the first week of November. Alfred sat on the school board side of the aisle with the town's other two board members, a farmer named Elias Marsh and the doctor, Jonas Holt. Garrett Cole sat across from them with two members of the church council, both of whom owed Cole money or favors or both. Pauline sat at the back of the room. She had not been invited to speak, but she had not asked permission to attend, which Alfred thought showed excellent judgment. Cole made his case with smooth efficiency. The teacherage was inappropriate for an unmarried woman alone at the edge of town. It set a bad example. It opened the town to questions about its moral standards. He had a family willing to host Miss Lawson, a fine, upstanding family with a spare room at no cost. It was the obvious solution for everyone's benefit. He did not mention that the family in question was his own cousin's household, a man who owed Cole substantially. Alfred laid the town charter on the table. He read the relevant section. He was precise and unhurried about it, the way he was precise and unhurried about everything that mattered. The school board contract gave the teacher independent housing. The contract had been signed by the town mayor, who was not Cole. That was the end of the legal question. Cole smiled. The legal question is one thing, he said. The moral question is another. The moral question, Alfred said, is whether this town trusts a competent, qualified teacher to live independently and do her work, or whether we're going to make her dependent on whoever has political influence this week. I know which side of that question I'm on. There was a tense silence. Elias Marsh voted with Alfred. Jonas Holt voted with Alfred. Pauline kept the teacherage. Afterward, when the meeting broke up and people filtered out into the cold November night, Pauline appeared at Alfred's side on the porch of the church. "Thank you," she said. It was the first time she had said those two words to him with anything in them that was not simply functional. "Don't thank me," Alfred said. "Thank the town charter." "I'm thanking the man who apparently wrote the relevant section of the town charter," she said. Her eyes were steady on his in the lamplight spilling through the church door. "Hoskins told me. He said you pushed for that provision 2 years ago when nobody else saw the need for it." Alfred was quiet for a moment. "I saw the need for it," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Alfred Bailey," she said, "you are considerably more complicated than you look." He didn't know what to say to that, which almost never happened to him. "Good night, Mr. Bailey," she said, and she walked to the teacherage at the edge of town. He stood on the church porch in the cold and watched until she was safely inside, and the lamp in her window was lit. Then he went home, and he sat in his kitchen for a long time thinking about a woman who thanked men by looking at them like she was deciding whether they were worth the risk. November went on. The days shortened, and the cold came down from the north in earnest. Alfred found that his visits to Caldwell had settled into a rhythm that he no longer pretended was about anything other than what it was. He came to town 3 or 4 mornings a week. On some of those mornings, if the school bell had not yet rung, Pauline would be outside the teacherage or at the general store, and they would talk. The conversations expanded slowly, the way a river expands in spring, finding new channels almost without intending to. She told him about Boston, about the schooling system there, about a previous teaching position in Ohio that had ended badly in ways she was not yet specific about but which had clearly left marks. He told her about the cattle operation, about the 15 years he had spent building it from nothing after his father's death, about the men and families who worked with him and what he owed them. What they did not talk about was what was happening between them. It existed in the pauses and in the way they both leaned slightly toward each other when the other was speaking, in the way Alfred always positioned himself between her and any unpredictable variables on the street without ever making a show of it, in the way Pauline had begun occasionally saving him the seat beside her when the town had one of its community dinners. Garrett Cole watched all of it. Alfred noticed Cole watching. Cole was a man who liked leverage, And Alfred knew that Cole understood he had lost the first engagement over the teacherage. Men like Cole always came back with a secondary plan. The trap, when it was laid, was elegant in its simplicity. It was set on a Friday evening in the third week of November, at the community harvest supper that the church hosted every year, a holdover tradition from the early settlement days when the whole town gathered to mark the end of the working season. Everyone attended. It was the kind of event where social lines blurred and people said things under the warmth and noise of a communal meal that they might not say in the sharp clarity of daylight. Alfred arrived to find Pauline already there, sitting at the long table near the front. She had a glass of the sweet cider that Hoskins always brought, and she was in conversation with the doctor's wife, a cheerful, loquacious woman named Mary Holt. Alfred got himself a plate and found the space across from her, and for a while everything was straightforward and good. It was later, when the dinner had settled into that relaxed middle phase of the evening and groups had shifted and reorganized, that Cole made his move. He waited until Alfred had stepped away to speak with Elias Marsh about a fencing issue on the north boundary of the Marsh farm. He waited until Pauline was briefly alone at the table, the Holt woman having gone to get more cider. Alfred saw it happening from across the room. He could not hear what Cole was saying, but he could see Pauline's posture change, the careful closing down of her face. The stillness that was not calm but was the performance of calm over something that was not calm at all. He crossed the room. He arrived just in time to hear Cole say, with his smooth, particular brand of concern, "I only mention it because people talk, Miss Lawson. And when a young woman of uncertain background arrives in a town and immediately takes an interest in a wealthy man of influence, people naturally wonder about her motives." Alfred stopped beside Pauline's shoulder. "Garrett," he said. Cole looked at him with an expression of pleasant neutrality. "Alfred, we were just talking." "I heard what you were just talking," Alfred said. His voice was flat and entirely controlled, which Pauline would later tell him was one of the more frightening sounds she had ever heard. "You should think carefully about what you say next." "I'm only expressing the community's concern," Cole said. "Nothing more." "The community," Alfred said, "didn't ask you to speak for it on this subject." Cole smiled and excused himself. Alfred stood there for a moment, and then he sat down beside Pauline in the vacated chair. She was quiet. Her hands were flat on the table, pressed down, controlled. "You don't have to say anything," Alfred said quietly. "He's done this before with other people. It's how he works." "He said people are wondering about my background," Pauline said, her voice very low and even. "He implied that I have a hidden motive for being here, that I came west for reasons other than teaching." A pause. "He implied that my connection to you in particular is calculated." Alfred looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Is any of it true?" She turned to look at him with an expression that was sharp and direct, and also, underneath everything, deeply tired. "I came here to teach school," she said. "That is the beginning and end of my reason for being in Caldwell, Kansas." "I know that," Alfred said. "Then why did you ask?" "Because I wanted to give you the space to say it," he said. "Not for my benefit, for yours." The sharpness in her face softened, fractionally, imperceptibly, unless you had spent weeks learning to read her the way Alfred had spent weeks learning to read her. "He said something else," she said, very quietly. "He said that if I persisted in my current living arrangement and my current associations, he would write to the school board's parent organization in Topeka and suggest that my character references be re-examined." A pause. "I have a dark past, Mr. Bailey. Not a criminal one, but the kind that men like Garrett Cole can use if they're determined to." Alfred was very still. "Tell me," he said. She looked at him for a long moment with that examining gaze that he had come to understand was her most fundamental act of trust assessment. "Not here," she said. "Whenever you're ready," he said. She nodded once and returned to her cider, and they sat together in the noise and warmth of the harvest supper while Alfred thought about Garrett Cole and about dark pasts, and about the absolute certainty he now felt that whatever Pauline Lawson was carrying, she should not have to carry it alone. She came to the ranch 2 days later, on a Sunday afternoon. She rode out on the horse she had been boarding at the livery stable, a steady bay mare that she handled with the confidence of someone who had been riding since childhood despite the East Coast origins. She found Alfred in the yard near the barn, working on a wagon wheel that needed a new spoke, and she tied her horse at the fence and stood watching him for a moment. "You said whenever I was ready," she said. "I did," he said. He finished tapping the spoke in, wiped his hands on his cloth and looked at her. "Can we walk?" she asked. They walked out to the near pasture, where the late November grass was tawny and dry, and the sky overhead was the specific deep blue of Kansas in autumn. Alfred was quiet beside her, not pushing, not filling the silence with noise the way most people did when silence made them uncomfortable. "In Ohio," she said after a few minutes, "I was engaged to be married." Alfred said nothing. He listened. His name was Thomas Mercer. He was a school board administrator. He had influence and standing, and he seemed, when I met him, to be the kind of man who understood what it meant to do meaningful work. She paused, looking at the horizon. He was not that man. He was a man who understood what it meant to control meaningful work and the people who did it, and to call that understanding. Another pause. The wind moved through the dry grass around them. "He was not violent," she said carefully, "so I want to be clear about what I mean. But he was the kind of man who made you smaller day by day, so gradually you almost didn't notice until you were barely recognizable to yourself. He controlled money. He controlled social access. He controlled which families' homes I could visit and which I could not. He controlled my correspondence." Her voice was even, factual, the voice of a woman who had processed this 1,000 times but found that processing and healing were not the same thing. "When I broke the engagement, he made sure everyone in the district understood that I had behaved dishonorably, that I had misled him about my intentions and my character. He had enough influence that most people believed him or were afraid not to." Alfred was quiet for a long moment. "That's why you came west," he said. "Ohio was no longer possible," she said simply. "Kansas was as far as my savings could get me with a viable teaching position at the end." "He has no reach here," Alfred said. "Not directly," she said. "But Cole, if he writes to Topeka, could use the Ohio situation as the dark past he implied I was hiding. And it would look, to people who don't know the full story, like a woman of questionable character." "Pauline," Alfred said, and it was the first time he had used her given name directly rather than Miss Lawson, and they both registered it, the slight change in the air between them. "I have considerable standing with the Topeka School Board. I've been involved in building schools across 3 counties. If Cole writes, I write back, and what I write will carry more weight than anything Cole can produce." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "Why would you do that?" "Because you deserve to teach your class without someone holding your past over your head," he said. "And because what happened to you in Ohio was a betrayal of exactly the kind that should not get to follow a person forever." She looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, something raw and unguarded that she quickly brought back under control, but not before he had seen it. "You are," she said, "a very unusual man, Alfred Bailey." "So I've been told," he said. She almost smiled. It was a near thing and then it was gone, but it had been real. They walked back to the barn in a silence that had changed its quality, become warmer and more complicated, and when she rode back toward town in the early afternoon, Alfred watched her go and stood in the yard for a long time afterward, not doing anything at all. December came in cold and bright. The relationship between Alfred and Pauline had reached a state that both of them understood clearly, and neither of them had named directly. He rode into town every morning. He sat beside her at community events. He walked with her after school, let out on the days the weather was good enough for it. They had long conversations about everything, about books and politics, and the particular difficulties of building something real in a place that felt perpetually temporary, about the injustice of the systems that controlled who got to succeed and who got pushed out, about what it meant to make a home in a place that had not yet decided whether it was a home or just a way station. What Alfred had not done, what he held himself back from doing with the same deliberate discipline that governed every other part of his life, was say anything that crossed the line from friendship into something that required a different response from her. He knew why he held back. He was not a man who deceived himself about his own motivations. He held back because Pauline Lawson had spent years in a relationship where a man's expressed feeling had been used as leverage over her, had been the instrument of her gradual diminishment, and he would not put anything resembling pressure on her for any reason, not his own feelings, not his own loneliness, not the way she had become the clearest thing in his field of vision on any given day. He would wait until she was ready, or he would wait forever, and he was at peace with both options. What he had not accounted for was Cole's second move. It came in the second week of December, in the form of a letter from the Topeka School Board requesting a formal review of Pauline Lawson's contract and character references. Cole had moved faster than Alfred had expected, and he had used a channel Alfred had not anticipated, going not through the parent organization, but through a member of the state legislature who owed Cole a favor, and who had written to the board on what he described as behalf of concerned citizens in Caldwell. Pauline came to Alfred with the letter on a Tuesday morning, and the expression on her face when she handed it to him was the expression of someone who had been waiting for this particular disaster since the moment she had arrived. "He did it," she said. Alfred read the letter. Then he read it again. Then he set it on the kitchen table and looked at it. "I need 2 days," he said. "Alfred, 2 days," he said. "Trust me." She looked at him with that assessing gaze. Then she said, "All right." He spent those 2 days writing. He wrote to every school board member he knew in Topeka, which was 3 of them directly and 2 more through intermediaries. He wrote to the mayor of Caldwell, who did not like Cole but had been avoiding conflict with him. He wrote to Elias Marsh and Jonas Holt and got their signatures on a formal statement of support. He wrote a detailed personal account of the Cole family's history of manipulation in local school governance, with specific documented instances going back 4 years. He also, on the second evening, rode 30 miles north to the county seat and filed a formal complaint with the county commissioner's office about Cole's use of a state legislative contact for local political purposes. It was a long shot, but it was real. When he brought the responses back to Pauline on Thursday morning, setting the stack of letters and signed statements on her kitchen table in the teacherage, she looked at the pile and then looked at him. "You rode to the county seat," she said. He had not told her that. "One of the liverymen talks," he said, without particular concern. "Alfred," she said, and her voice had something in it that had not been there before, something fragile and fierce at once. This is your standing, your relationships. Your time, you're spending all of it on my problem." "It's not just your problem," he said. "Cole has been poisoning this community's governance for years. You're just the current target. Stopping him is worth doing regardless." "Don't do that," she said. He looked at her. "Don't do what?" "Don't make it only about principle," she said. "Don't hide it behind policy when I'm standing right here." And there it was, laid out between them in the morning light of her small kitchen, the thing that neither of them had said. Alfred was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the directness that was the only honest way he knew how to speak, "I didn't think you wanted me to say the other thing." "I didn't," she said. "And then I did, and I've been trying to figure out the difference." She looked at the stack of letters on her table, at all the work he had done on her behalf without asking for a single thing in return. "The difference," she said slowly, "is that Thomas Mercer said things to make me feel obligated. You do things and then deliberately say nothing, so I have every option open." Alfred said nothing. He waited. "I am trying," Pauline said, and her voice was careful in the way of someone carrying something breakable, "to learn the difference between a man who gives so that you owe him and a man who gives because that's who he is." She looked at him directly. "I think you're the second kind, but I'm afraid of being wrong again, and I need you to know that." "I know that," Alfred said quietly. "I've known it since October." "And you never pushed," she said. Something in her voice was uncertain and wondering. "No," he said. "Why not?" she asked, and the question was genuine, almost desperate in its honesty. Most men would have. "Because," Alfred said, "I'd rather have your trust than anything else you could offer me, and trust isn't something you can push someone into." The silence in the kitchen was complete and full and very warm. Then Pauline Lawson, who had been small and careful and contained for so long, took 2 steps across her kitchen and put her hand against Alfred Bailey's chest, not an invitation exactly, but in the simple act of contact, of reaching, of testing whether the ground was real. He put his hand over hers. That was all. They stood like that for a long moment, in the December morning light coming through the teacherage window, while outside Caldwell went about its business, and the wind moved down from the north with the particular cold that meant the first hard snow was coming. "I'm not good at this," she said, which was the most vulnerable thing he had heard her say. "Neither am I," he said honestly. She almost laughed. The tension in her chest loosened by a fraction. "The Topeka board will back down," he said. "You'll keep the school." "And then what?" she asked, and she meant it as a much larger question than the school. "Then we figure out the next part," he said, without any particular hurry. She looked up at him, this woman who trusted nothing and no one without cause, who had rebuilt herself from wreckage in a place that had no patience for wreckage, and she nodded. "Without any particular hurry," she agreed. The snow came 2 days later, the first real blizzard of the season, and it lasted 3 days. When it cleared, the world was white and silent and still, and Caldwell looked momentarily like a place that could hold anything, even something as unlikely as a man and a woman figuring out how to be careful with each other in the most impatient country on earth. Christmas came and went. The Topeka School Board, faced with Alfred's stack of letters and his documented complaint about Cole's methods, quietly set aside the review request and sent Pauline a formal acknowledgement of her contract. Cole received a letter from the county commissioner's office suggesting he confine his civic contributions to matters within his direct purview. Cole was not finished, Alfred knew. Men like Cole were never finished, but he had been checked firmly and publicly enough that he would need time to regroup, and time was something Alfred intended to use. January in Kansas was cold and iron-hard. The ranch work was heavy, and Alfred spent long days in the saddle and long evenings with accounts and records by the fire. He came to town less frequently in the deep winter, which meant he saw Pauline less frequently, and he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that this was a deprivation rather than a neutral fact. On the days he did come to town, they had developed a habit of having supper together at the hotel dining room, the only place in Caldwell that served a hot meal of any dignity in the evenings. They sat at the corner table that had become, by unofficial community consensus, their table, and they talked for hours over the kind of meals that the hotel cook, an older woman named Pearl, clearly prepared with extra attention on the evenings she saw Alfred ride in. On one of those January evenings, deep in the cold, Pauline told him about her father, who had been a schoolteacher himself and who had died of a fever when she was 12, leaving her mother to raise 3 daughters on the proceeds of a seamstress business that barely covered rent. She told him about putting herself through the teacher's college in Boston on a combination of scholarships and late-night work at a bookbinder's shop. She told him how much she had wanted the teaching work not just as a livelihood, but as the thing itself, the actual transmission of knowledge into minds that did not yet have it, the watching of understanding arrive on a child's face. Alfred listened to all of it. He listened the way he did everything, with complete attention, not waiting for a gap to insert himself, but genuinely receiving what she gave him. In return, he told her things he had not told most people, about the particular loneliness of building something you were proud of in a place where there was nobody to show it to. About the death of his mother when he was 19, 2 years after his father, which had left him entirely alone in the world with a half-built ranch, and the kind of grief that has nowhere to go except into work. About the men he had hired over the years, the families on his land, how much of his sense of belonging he had built through those connections because there was no family left to provide it. "You've built a family on the ranch," Pauline said with quiet recognition. "I suppose I have," he said. "It's not conventional." "Conventional is a word people use when they want to control how you live," she said, and there was a lightness in her voice that he had not heard there before. He looked at her across the table with a feeling that was so large and so simple that it was almost frightening. She was looking back at him with an expression that was new, open, and undefended in a way he had not seen on her face before, and he understood that something had shifted in her in the past weeks, that the long, slow process of learning to trust had reached a different terrain. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the way she had put hers over his in her kitchen in December, and she turned her hand under his and held it. It was February before he kissed her, because he was not going to rush a single thing, and she was worth every patient day. It happened at the end of an evening walk, on a night when the cold had broken unexpectedly, and the stars were extraordinary overhead, the kind of Kansas sky that made you feel simultaneously very small and very much exactly where you were supposed to be. They had walked the length of the town and back, and they were standing at the door of the teacherage, and she was looking up at the sky, and then she looked at him, and the invitation was not aggressive or dramatic. It was simply the way her face was, open and present and direct. He kissed her gently, carefully, the way you handle something you intend to keep. She kissed him back with a warmth that surprised them both, as if she had been holding it for months, which they both had, and afterward she leaned her forehead briefly against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there in the cold Kansas February night, under the enormous stars, not saying anything because there was nothing that needed saying. March came in with mud and new grass pushing through, and the specific energy of the frontier in spring, when everything that had been frozen and held down began to move again. The ranch came alive with new calves and the work of repair and preparation, and Alfred was busy in ways that the winter had not demanded. But he was present. He came to town. He sat in the corner table at Pearl's hotel dining room. He walked with Pauline in the evenings when weather permitted. He showed her the ranch properly in the middle of March, not just the front yard glimpse of that first Sunday in November, but the whole of it, the north pasture and the creek bottom, and the rise where you could see 20 miles in every direction when the sky was clear. She stood on that rise and looked out at the enormous, indifferent, beautiful land, and she said, "You built all of this alone." "Not entirely," he said, "but mostly." She was quiet for a moment. "It's extraordinary," she said, and she meant the land and the work and the accomplishment and probably also something about him, and he let it stand without trying to diminish it. They were walking back toward the barn when she said, carefully and without preamble, "Alfred, I want to tell you something." "All right," he said. "I am not," she said, "a woman who can be still for very long. I have opinions and I will argue for them, and I will not modify them simply because they are inconvenient. I have had to survive on my own, and I have built habits around that survival that will not disappear simply because circumstances change." She paused. "I am telling you this because you should know exactly what I am before this becomes something that's harder to undo." Alfred looked at her with a steadiness that was not challenging but was completely honest. "Pauline," he said, "every one of those things is a quality I specifically value in you. I'm not looking for something easier. I'm looking for something real." She searched his face for a long moment. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. They walked back to the barn, and somewhere in the late afternoon light she took his hand, and he held it, and that was that. April brought a complication. It came in the form of a man named James Corby, who arrived in Caldwell on the Thursday stage and went directly to Hoskins' store to ask about the schoolteacher. Alfred heard about this within a day, because Caldwell was 312 souls who knew everything, and Hoskins was constitutionally unable to keep information to himself when it might be relevant to someone's well-being. Corby was a lawyer from Ohio. He was 35 years old, well-dressed, professionally courteous, and he carried papers. He found Pauline at the school at the end of the day on Friday, when the children had gone home and she was cleaning the board. Alfred was in town that afternoon and saw Corby go into the church. He stood outside for a moment thinking, and then went in after him. He arrived in time to see Pauline standing very still in the middle of the schoolroom and Corby holding an open document folder. "Miss Lawson," Corby was saying, in a voice that was professionally sympathetic in a way that scraped at something, "Mr. Mercer simply wants an acknowledgement. A letter stating that the account of events as publicly discussed in the Columbus papers was accurate, and that you have no further claims related to the end of the engagement. In exchange, he will withdraw any future correspondence to professional or civic organizations regarding your character." Alfred stopped in the doorway. Pauline's back was to him. He could not see her face. He could see that her shoulders were squared, deliberately and precisely squared, with the specific effort of a woman who will not let herself be seen to be afraid. "I see," she said. Her voice was completely flat. "It's a straightforward arrangement," Corby said. "Mr. Mercer bears you no ill will. I want you to understand that." "What he is asking me to sign," Pauline said in the same flat voice, "is a document confirming his version of events in which I behaved dishonorably, and which would be available to be produced against me in any future professional dispute. In exchange, he will stop threatening a woman who left him 2 years ago for very good reasons." A pause. "Tell me, Mr. Corby, in your professional opinion, is that an equitable arrangement?" Corby had the grace to look somewhat uncomfortable. "My opinion, don't answer that," Pauline said. "It was rhetorical." Alfred stepped fully into the room. Corby looked up. Pauline turned. For one beat of a second, Alfred saw what was on her face before she brought it back under control, and it was not fear exactly. It was the particular exhaustion of a woman who had survived one thing and had hoped, so much, to be done surviving that specific thing. "This is a private matter," Corby said to Alfred, not aggressively, but with professional firmness. "This is a schoolroom in a town where I'm on the school board," Alfred said. "And this appears to be a coercive document being presented to the town's teacher at the end of her working day. I'm interested in what's happening here." Corby assessed him for a moment. "And you are?" "Alfred Bailey," Alfred said. Something in Corby's expression shifted in a way that suggested the name was not unfamiliar. Alfred filed that away. "Mr. Mercer's legal reach does not extend to Kansas in any actionable way," Alfred said. "Whatever you're offering her isn't a legal obligation. It's a threat dressed as an agreement. And I want you to know before you continue that whatever happens with that document, this woman is not without support in this town or in the state, and if your client persists in using professional channels to harass her, we will use every legal avenue available to address it." There was a silence. Then Corby closed his folder with the efficient motions of a man recalibrating. "I'll convey your position to my client," he said, and left. The room was quiet. Alfred turned to Pauline. She was looking at him with an expression that was multiple things at once, relief and something fierce and something that had been cracked open by the afternoon. "He's not going to stop," she said quietly. "He'll stop," Alfred said. "He's sending a lawyer, which means he's already been told he has no legal ground. He's trying to get what he wants through intimidation because it's the only remaining option." He paused. "We'll document this visit, add it to what we already have from the Topeka business. If he comes at you again through any channel, we'll have grounds for a formal legal response." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she crossed the schoolroom and put her arms around him, and he held her, in the empty schoolroom with the day's lesson still written on the board behind them, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and took one long, shaking breath that she had clearly been holding since Corby had walked in. "I am so tired," she said, "of being the thing that men fight over." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry. You're not part of the problem," she said, lifting her head. "No," he said, "but I'm part of the reason Corby came to Caldwell. Whatever his client knows about you and me." She looked at him. There was a question in her eyes. Mercer sent a lawyer to a Kansas cow town, Alfred said. That's not just about a letter. That's a man who's been watching you, who knows you've built something here and who wants to destabilize it. The understanding moved across her face. He doesn't want me to have this, she said quietly. He never wanted me to have anything I built for myself. He can want what he likes, Alfred said. He's in Ohio, you're in Kansas, and you're not going anywhere. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had stood beside her for 7 months without once making her feel like a problem he was managing rather than a person he was choosing. Alfred, she said. Yes, he said. I love you, she said. It came out straightforward and clean without dramatics, the way she said most things, but her eyes were very full. He looked at her with everything he had kept carefully arranged and controlled and patient for 7 months, and it all came forward at once, simply and without reservation. I love you, he said. They stood in the schoolroom while the April light went golden and long through the windows, and it was the most real thing that had happened to either of them in years. James Corby left Caldwell on the Monday stage. Alfred had spent Saturday drafting a letter to a law firm in Columbus with whom he had a connection through a cattle broker, laying out the timeline of Thomas Mercer's ongoing harassment and asking for a formal opinion on any available legal remedies. He sent a copy to Corby's forwarding address with a cover note that was polite and precise, and made very clear that any further contact from Mercer's legal team would be treated as the beginning of a formal legal proceeding. There was no further contact from Ohio. May came, and with it the full-blown Kansas spring, the grasslands green and enormous, the sky enormous above them, the days long and warm and full of the specific golden energy of a place that was still, even in 1877, being made rather than already made. The cattle work was in its full season, and Alfred was busy from before dawn until after dark most days. But the world was good, and he moved through it with the particular ease of a man who has finally found the gravity that was always supposed to hold him. He had been thinking about the future for months. He had been thinking about it in the way he thought about the ranch, which was carefully and with long horizons, and without letting wishful thinking substitute for practical planning. He knew what he wanted. He had known since February. The question was the right moment, the right approach, the thing that would make it as clear as possible that what he was offering was not a capture but an invitation. He thought about it on a Thursday afternoon in the middle of May, when he had finished with the spring fence check and was sitting on the rise with the 20-mile view, his horse grazing nearby. The sky was the kind of blue that seems to go on forever, and the grass was moving in the wind below him, and it occurred to him with a clarity that was almost laughable in its simplicity that there was no perfect moment. There was just now, and now was good enough. He rode to Caldwell the following day, which was a Friday, and he was there when school let out. He met Pauline at the schoolroom door, and they walked toward the main street together in the warm May afternoon, and they were talking about something ordinary, the condition of the road from Wichita, the delivery of new reading primers that Hoskins had ordered, and Alfred was about to say the thing he had come to say when the sound of a commotion from the direction of the saloon pulled their attention. It was nothing serious. 2 cowboys from a northern spread having an argument that had gotten loud. But in the moment of distraction, Garrett Cole stepped off the saloon porch directly into their path. Cole had been quiet since the county commissioner's letter in January. He looked at them now with the expression of a man who had been waiting for something and had decided that something would have to be provided rather than waited for. "Bailey," he said, "word reached me from Columbus, Ohio. Interesting communications." Alfred looked at him with the expression he kept for when patience was required but not felt. "A lawyer came through here in April," Cole said, with pleasant conversational tone, addressing Pauline directly now. "Asking about you." And the story he was asking about, what I've heard of it, sounds like the kind of history that a permanent employee of a church-funded school might find it difficult to explain away if it were more widely known. Pauline was very still beside Alfred. "Garrett," Alfred said, and his voice was the flat gravel sound that had preceded difficult moments before. "This is the last time." Cole's eyes flickered to him. "Is that a threat, Alfred?" "It's a fact," Alfred said. "You've used your position to try to push out a qualified teacher. You've used state connections to interfere with her contract. You arranged a lawyer from Ohio to come here and intimidate her. And now you're standing on the street suggesting you'll spread her private history around town if she doesn't cooperate with whatever you actually want." His voice was absolutely controlled and completely unmistakable. "What do you want, Garrett? Say it plainly." Cole looked surprised briefly that he had been read so completely. Then he recovered. "I want the school under proper oversight," he said. "The kind of oversight that the church council provides. I've always been clear about that." "The kind of oversight," Alfred said, "that lets you control what children learn and who teaches them and what it costs people who don't line up behind your politics." He took a step forward, not threatening, not crowding, just deliberate. "You're done. Whatever you try from here, we're documented. The mayor's office, the county commissioner, the state board. You move against her again and you lose everything you've built in this town. I will make sure of it personally." Cole looked at him for a long moment, then at Pauline, then back at Alfred. He left without another word. Alfred and Pauline stood on the main street of Caldwell in the May afternoon. The two cowboys from the saloon had stopped their argument to watch. Old Bessie Crane had stopped sweeping her store front. Several horses stood still at the rail. Alfred turned to Pauline. She was looking at him with wide, clear eyes, not afraid, not relieved exactly, but something more complex, something that was accumulating toward a decision. He had come to town today to say something. The moment was nothing like he had imagined. The street was full of witnesses. Cole had just disrupted everything he had planned, and yet, he thought about patience and careful timing and waiting for the right moment. He thought about all of it. Then he took his hat off. "Pauline," he said. She saw it before he moved. He could tell by her face, the way she went very still in a completely different way than she had been still a moment ago. He went down on one knee on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in front of the entire watching town, in the May afternoon light, with the dust of the street under his knee, and the sun going long and golden in the west. Alfred Bailey, who had told everyone who had ever asked that he would never kneel for anyone, not for a king or a president or any power on earth, was on one knee before Sundown. He looked up at her from the ground, and he held his hat against his chest, and his voice was quiet enough that only she could hear it clearly. "I told you I'd never kneel for anyone," he said. "I meant it when I said it." "Then stand up," she said, barely above a whisper. Her eyes were very bright. "I can't," he said simply. "Not until you hear me." He kept his eyes on her, steady and completely without performance. "You came to this town with your back against a wall. You fought every inch of what should have been given to you freely. You've built something real here in a place that tried repeatedly to take it from you. And for 7 months you've let me stand beside you, and it has been the best thing in my life." He paused. "I am not Thomas Mercer. I am not Garrett Cole. I'm a man who has built something he is proud of and who has, for the first time, found someone he would rather share it with than keep it to himself." Another pause. "Pauline Lawson, will you marry me?" The street was absolutely silent. Pauline looked down at him for a long moment. Her face was doing several things at once, and her eyes were bright with something she was not trying particularly hard to contain. "Alfred Bailey," she said, "I have about 3 years of reasons to be afraid of this question." "I know," he said. "And I am going to ask you to stand up," she said. He stood. She was looking at him with that face, open and direct and a little bit fierce and entirely hers. "Yes," she said. The watching street did not erupt into the celebration that it would have in a less reserved community. But Bessie Crane made an audible sound of satisfaction and resumed sweeping with considerably more energy. The two cowboys from the saloon exchanged money, which suggested they had been wagering on this outcome for some time. Hoskins appeared in the door of the general store with an expression of profound personal vindication. Alfred took her hand, and she held his, and they stood on the main street in the last of the long May afternoon light, and it was the beginning of something that both of them understood would hold. They were married in June, in the same church where the school board meetings were held, and where Pauline had been teaching for 8 months. Hoskins gave her away, which she found absurdly touching, since she did not particularly need giving away and told him so, but she allowed it because he was so pleased by the role. Mary Holt served as her witness. Elias Marsh and Jonas Holt stood with Alfred. Garrett Cole did not attend. He had, in the weeks following the street confrontation, grown markedly quieter, and the county commissioner had followed up on Alfred's original complaint with a formal inquiry that occupied Cole's attention considerably. He was not destroyed as a civic figure, but he was checked, genuinely and durably checked, and the town breathed easier for it. The ceremony was brief and real, and exactly what both of them wanted. When the minister asked Alfred if he took this woman, Alfred said, "I do," with the same direct conviction he brought to everything that mattered, and when Pauline said the same words she said them with a steadiness that was no longer the performance of steadiness but the actual thing. When Alfred kissed her in front of the congregation, old Bessie Crane made another satisfied sound. They rode out to the ranch afterward in the June afternoon, and Alfred showed her the room he had spent 2 weeks quietly preparing, not overwhelming it, not performing domesticity, but making it genuinely ready for her to make it hers. She stood in the doorway and looked at it and then looked at him. "You painted it," she said. The walls were a warm cream color, which was not standard ranch house decor. "You mentioned once that you liked the color of the teacherage walls," he said. She crossed the room and kissed him with a thoroughness that made everything in the world feel properly ordered. The summer of 1877 was a working summer, as all summers on a Kansas cattle ranch were, but it was also the summer in which Alfred and Pauline built the particular rhythms of a shared life, the negotiations of two people who were each accustomed to being self-sufficient, and who were learning, gradually and with occasional friction, that being self-sufficient together was something different and better. Pauline continued teaching. She had made clear before the marriage that the school was her work, and she intended to continue it. And Alfred had made clear that this was not in question, which had been one of the reasons she said yes, rather than needing months more of deliberation. She rode from the ranch to town on school days and was back by late afternoon, and Alfred arranged his work around this rhythm so that there was usually someone at the ranch when she arrived, and he was not always still in the far pasture. They argued occasionally, because they were both people with strong opinions, and the frontier did not provide much cushioning for interpersonal friction. They argued about money once, about a decision Alfred had made regarding a cattle sale without consulting her, which he acknowledged immediately and without defensiveness was a habit he needed to break, because they were partners and financial decisions were shared decisions. They argued about the Cole situation once more, when Cole made a final attempt in August to reclaim influence on the school board, and Pauline wanted to handle it herself without Alfred's involvement, which Alfred understood but found difficult, and they reached an agreement about what constituted assistance versus control. The arguments were real and they resolved them, and they were better for having had them. What they were not was fragile. They had both been built hard by what they had survived, and they understood that the other one had the same strength, and they held each other with that understanding, which was not delicate but was enduring. In October, exactly 1 year after Pauline had stepped off the stage at Caldwell, she told Alfred she was expecting their child. She told him in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, with the same directness she brought to everything, and he put his coffee cup down and looked at her with an expression that was so unguarded and open that she laughed. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in both hands and kissed her forehead, and then her cheeks, and then properly, and she put her hands over his and laughed again. "A baby, Alfred," she said. "A baby," he repeated, with the tone of a man for whom this fact was still resolving itself into reality. "You might need to sit down," she said. "I'm sitting down," he said. He was not, but he sat down, pulling her with him so that she was on his knee on the kitchen chair, which was not the most comfortable arrangement either of them had ever been in, but which suited the moment perfectly. The baby was born in the spring of 1878, in May, in the same month that Alfred had proposed on the main street. He was a boy, which Pauline had somehow known with the certainty of a woman whose intuitions had always been reliable, and they named him Thomas, not after Thomas Mercer, with whom Pauline had made her private peace, but after her father, the schoolteacher from Boston who had died too young and who deserved to have his name carried forward. Thomas Bailey came into the world on a Tuesday morning with the specific volume and specificity of purpose that would characterize his entire subsequent life. Alfred held him in the kitchen of the ranch house with an expression that was, Pauline thought, the most unguarded she had ever seen on his face, which was saying something because she had seen his face in considerable unguarding over the past year. "He's very small," Alfred said. "He is going to grow," Pauline said, from the bed where she was recovering with the particular accomplished exhaustion of a woman who has just done an extraordinary thing. "Obviously," Alfred said, not quite as casually as he intended. He was still holding the baby with the careful attention of a man who does not want to drop the most important thing he has ever held. The families on the ranch came to see the baby, the Marsh family and the Holt family and the third family, the Ray's family, who had joined the ranch the previous winter and whose children were among Pauline's students. Their congratulations were genuine and warm, and there was the specific celebration that happens in a working community when new life arrives, when the continuation of everything is made concrete. Old Bessie Crane sent a quilt from town. Hoskins sent a hamper. Even Pearl from the hotel dining room sent a jar of her best preserves. Garrett Cole sent nothing, but nobody had expected him to. Thomas Bailey grew with the determined enthusiasm of a child, raised on a ranch, and educated by a woman who considered the transmission of knowledge a sacred responsibility. By the time he was 3, he was following his father around the ranch with the serious observation of someone filing information for future use. By the time he was 4, he was learning letters with the same focused intensity his mother brought to everything. The school in Caldwell continued to be Pauline's work and her pride. In 1879, she argued successfully for an expansion of the school curriculum to include natural sciences and geography, which the new school board supported enthusiastically, Cole having been quietly retired from any civic influence the previous year following the conclusion of the county commissioner's inquiry. The new board included 2 women, which was not common in Kansas in 1879, but which Pauline had worked toward with the same methodical determination she applied to everything. In 1880, their second child arrived, a girl they named Alina after Alfred's mother. Alina was, from her first moments, entirely unlike her brother in temperament, where Thomas was focused and deliberate. Alina was expansive and social and vocal, and Alfred, who had spent his life being quiet and contained, found to his private amusement that his daughter was entirely unintimidated by anything and would clearly never be quiet a day in her life. He adored her completely. Caldwell in the early 1880s was changing, the way all frontier towns were changing. The cattle drives that had made it a border town of consequence were shifting in their patterns as the railheads moved, and the fencing of the open range progressed. The specific wild edge that had made the town both dangerous and vital was softening, and the community that had been 312 souls in 1877 was becoming something more settled and complex. Alfred's ranch grew. He acquired additional acreage to the east in 1880 and added a second cattle crew. The families on the land multiplied as well. The Marsh children grew, and one of them married a girl from a neighboring spread and started their own household on the north section. What had been Alfred's solitary project became a community of its own, small but real. Pauline built the school into something that the territory recognized as exceptional. In 1881, The county school board in Topeka sent an official commendation for the reading outcomes in Caldwell's school, which was the kind of formal recognition that meant her work was undeniable even to people who had never met her. She sent Alfred a copy of the commendation by way of a note that read simply, "The town charter comes through again," and he kept it in his desk drawer along with everything else that mattered. On a warm evening in the spring of 1882, they were sitting on the porch of the ranch house after the children were in bed. Thomas was 4 and Alina was nearly 2, and the house had the particular settling quiet of a place full of sleeping children. The horses were in the pasture. The stars were coming out over the enormous dark land. Alfred was in the porch chair and Pauline was leaning against him, which was one of her favorite positions, she had told him once, because it was the only place in her life where she did not have to be on watch for anything. "Do you remember the first thing you said to me?" she asked. "It's Hoskins' store," he said. He remembered everything. She laughed. "It was not particularly romantic." "Neither of us was especially romantic that morning," he said. "I thought you were blocking the door," she said. "I probably was." She was quiet for a moment. The night moved around them, warm and full of the specific smells of a working ranch in spring, grass and horses, and the wood smoke from the chimney. "When did you know?" she asked. "Actually know." He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything. "October," he said. "When you came out of the stage and walked straight at me without moving around me. I didn't know what I knew, but I noticed something." She turned to look up at him. "October," she said. "You waited 9 months from October to May." "You were worth the wait," he said simply. She held his gaze for a moment and then shook her head slowly, not in negation but in that particular wonder she had started expressing more freely in the years since she had stopped guarding herself. "Alfred Bailey," she said. "Pauline Bailey," he said. She smiled. She had taken his name with the same considered deliberateness she brought to everything, and she never tired of hearing it on his voice. "I love you," she said. It came easy now. After 5 years, it came as easy as breathing, which was itself a kind of miracle she took nothing for granted about. "I love you," he said. The stars came out fully above them, and the Kansas night was enormous and still. And somewhere inside the house, Thomas turned in his sleep and made a sound that was either a complaint or a comment, and Alina did not wake, and the ranch was quiet and whole and real. In 1883, their third child was born, another boy, who they named William after a man named William Hoskins, because the storekeeper had died peacefully the previous winter at 68 years old, and had left a gap in the community that felt like a specific kind of loss. Hoskins had been the one who had written to Boston to find a schoolteacher. He had been the first person in Caldwell to understand that Alfred Bailey came to town 3 mornings a week for reasons that had nothing to do with fence wire or salt blocks. He had given the bride away at a wedding he had been quietly engineering for months before it happened. Naming the baby William was the right thing to do. Alfred and Pauline both knew it without discussion. William was a cheerful, sturdy baby who slept admirably and ate with enthusiasm, and showed every sign of becoming someone whose primary relationship with the world would be one of straightforward physical engagement with it, which was its own particular and necessary kind of intelligence. The ranch continued. The school continued. The children grew. The years moved forward with the unhurried inevitability of good things that have found their ground and taken root properly. Cole died in 1884, of a stroke, not in infamy but in the diminished private life of a man whose reach had been permanently contracted. Alfred attended the funeral because that was what you did in a town of 312 souls, and because there was nothing in him that needed to diminish a dead man. Pauline did not attend because she did not perform things she did not feel, but she acknowledged that the chapter was genuinely closed. Thomas Mercer made no further contact. Alfred's letter to the Columbus law firm had been part of it, and the quiet accumulation of documented evidence had been part of it, but Alfred suspected that the deeper truth was simply that Mercer had finally understood that Pauline Lawson was beyond his reach, genuinely and permanently, in every way that mattered. On the evening of their 7th anniversary, Alfred and Pauline were back on the rise with the 20-mile view, the one he had shown her in March of their courtship year. The children were with the Ray's family at the ranch below. The sun was going down in the west in the extraordinary Kansas colors, orange and red and deep gold, and the land spread out around them in every direction. "I did not plan to be here," Pauline said, which was simply true. She had not planned Kansas. She had not planned Caldwell. She had not planned Alfred Bailey standing in the door of Hoskins' store with fence wire and a directness she had not known how to categorize. "I didn't plan to be here either," Alfred said. "And by here, I mean the specific here of any of it. The version of here that has you and 3 children and 15 years of work that means something." She looked at him. The sunset was behind him and his face was in shadow, but she knew every line of it. "It was you," she said simply. "The whole thing was you." "Half of it," he said. "More than half," she said. He shook his head and she shook hers, and it was an old argument that neither of them had any particular interest in winning. He took her hand. She held his. The sun went all the way down, burning the horizon the specific colors of a place that was always beautiful even when it was hard, maybe especially when it was hard. The man who had sworn he would never kneel for anyone sat on a hillside in the Kansas evening with his wife of 7 years and his 3 children asleep below, and his 15 years of work spread out around him. And he looked at everything he had built and everything that had been given to him in return for having the sense to go down on one knee before sundown on a Friday in May. And he thought that surrender, the right kind of surrender to the right person, was not weakness after all. It was the bravest thing he had ever done. Pauline rested her head against his shoulder, looking out at the darkening land, and she thought about Boston and Ohio, and the long cold road through Wichita, and the stage that had brought her to a town at the edge of everything. And she thought about a man standing in a doorway with fence wire, and a directness that had looked, at first, like just another problem to navigate. She thought about what it meant to be seen. Not managed, not controlled, not diminished, but genuinely, completely seen by a person who looked without wanting to change what they saw. She thought she could spend the rest of her life on this hillside with this man and call it the best possible use of any life she could have imagined. The stars came out, the enormous Kansas stars, the same ones that had watched them stand outside the teacherage in February and on the main street in May and in the church in June, and in the kitchen when the baby came. The same stars that watched over everything, the built things and the growing things and the loved things, steady and indifferent and beautiful, while below them 2 people who had come separately to the edge of the world found in each other the reason to stay. Alfred Bailey put his arm around his wife. Pauline Bailey leaned into him. The night was quiet. The land was still. Everything was exactly as it should be.